This is my number one. Isn't this a lot of fun? So it's Cat Stanley Space Demon coming at you again. And in the aftermath of this past week, where we lost everyone's KISS favorite member, Ace Frehley, his untimely, unfortunate, and tragic passing at age 74. Today's video, I want to take a look back at Ace's ominous warning to his KISS bandmates about the recording of the album, The Music from the Elder. So stick around, Cat Stanley Space Demons coming at ya! Okay, so by 1981, KISS were coming off two albums in which they had steered far away from their original raw rock sound to more of a pop-oriented direction, with albums like Dynasty, which featured the band's foray into disco. I Was Made for Loving You was a huge hit. Also had tracks on it like Sure Knows Something. And then they had, in 1980, they followed it up with the Unmasked album, which continued in that direction. Of course, the big song on that record, Shandy, I don't think it made a huge impact stateside, but I think it did well in Europe, and it was a big hit in Australia, allowed the band to tour over there. But following that more pop-oriented direction the band had gone in for those past couple years, they decided to take a big left turn, and rather than following the original plan, which was to make a big, heavy, raw rock record more in the vein of their previous albums, they decided instead to take a foray into progressive rock with the ill-fated concept project, Music from the Elder. They would call upon their old producer buddy, boy wonder Bob Ezrin, famous for producing the Alice Cooper albums, who of course was the architect behind the band's Destroyer album, which featured classics like Detroit Rock City, Beth, Do You Love Me, all those favorite songs KISS fans dig. A lot of fans were alienated by the more polished sound of that album, but on the strength of that big hit, Beth, it was a big hit. But they called upon Bob Ezrin, and they were all on board for this new progressive-oriented direction. It was their stab to try to reach out to rock critics who had always been dismissive of the band, their makeup image, their bombastic live shows. They tended to write them off musically. So in an effort to try to impress those critics, Bob Ezrin was implemented to be the mastermind of this concept record. But there was one KISS member who was not on board, who saw the writing on the wall and tried to warn his bandmates. That was, of course, KISS lead guitarist Ace Frehley. Here's what he had to say back in his 2011 memoir, No Regrets. Bob Ezrin is a brilliant producer, but when it came to the 9th KISS studio album, Music from the Elder, I disagreed with him and the band on many issues. I could see it from the beginning. I had the street smarts and common sense to take a giant step back and look at the project with an objective eye. And I knew it was a colossal mistake in judgment. Paul, Gene, and Bob didn't get it. They went forward with the whole ridiculous concept. To be perfectly candid, I never fully understood what the hell the record was supposed to be about. Gene had written some kind of story, and there was talk of turning it into a feature-length movie or animated film or something. Even after the KISS Meets the Phantom catastrophe, Gene was fascinated with Hollywood culture. Ezrin stoked the fire by suggesting that Gene's little story be used as the basis for some sort of big, multimedia, cross-platform vehicle for KISS. Part of the plan, apparently, was a concept record. As anyone who knows rock and roll can tell you, concept records can be career killers, even for the most talented bands. The problem is that instead of ending up with a masterpiece like The Who's Tommy, you could end up with Saucy Jack, Spinal Tap's unproduced rock opera about Jack the Ripper. You remember that one. You're a naughty one, Sulcy Jack, you're a hooty one, Sulcy Jack. And then Ace goes on to say, I co-wrote 2 songs for the record. One was called Escape from the Island, and the other was originally called Don't Run, but was later renamed Dark Light after Lou Reed rewrote some of the lyrics. I didn't understand the concept, and I didn't give a fuck about the central character, some old fart nobody knew anything about. It was ludicrous. I kept trying to tell the guys that if we released an album of self-indulgent nonsense, complete with spoken dialogue and haunting wind instruments, we'd be slaughtered. Our core fans would get pissed, and serious rock critics would laugh at it. It was doomed from the beginning. It didn't matter what I said, though. I was outvoted. And Ace goes on to say that producer Bob Ezrin has willingly taken considerable heat for that Music from the Elder record over the years and admitted that he was under the influence of a lot of substances at that time, which clouded his judgment. But Ace says this, he says, damn it, I was doing a lot of drugs too, but I could still see that the project was going to be a flop. And Ace says this, at one meeting after another, I went on record against it, but the other guys insisted on moving forward. And then Ace goes on to talk about how they recorded a big chunk of that Music from the Elder record at his home studio in Connecticut. Ace talks about how if he wasn't recording a guitar track or a vocal, he'd be upstairs shooting pool or having a quote-unquote toot, and that he was not enthusiastic about the project. He just was not engaged because he was so opposed to the album's direction, and he went into avoidance mode. And as they moved the project up to Bob Ezrin's native Canada, Ace decided to remain behind at home in Connecticut, and he continued to work on guitar solos and overdubs at home, but much to his dismay, a lot of his guitar solos that he recorded for that Music from the Elder album remained on the cutting room floor. They were missing from the final mix. But Ace does go on to say this about that Music from the Elder album, in spite of his ominous warnings to the band regarding the recording of that record. He goes on to say this, the thing is, Music from the Elder is not really a terrible album, it's just a terrible Kiss album. The songs themselves aren't all that bad, but some of them simply aren't appropriate for a Kiss album. We changed the costumes and cut our hair, and I went along for the sake of consistency. The whole thing was ridiculous. When I see video footage of Kiss performing songs from that album on television, trying to look serious and self-important, I don't know whether to laugh or cringe. Like I've always said, I'll try almost anything once, but if I had a do-over, I'd take a pass on Music from the Elder. I think we all would, and the Kiss Army would be grateful. But the ironic thing about that is, a lot of those fans, over the years, the Music from the Elder record has developed a considerable, probably more than cult following, because I think if you talk to a lot of Kiss fans, they really like the record. I myself, I do enjoy the album. I wouldn't put it there with the earlier raw rock and roll Kiss records, but I don't have anything. I agree with them. Doesn't necessarily sound like Kiss, but there's some cool heavy stuff on there. I really like Mr. Blackwell, Gene Simmons song on there. But that's the story. Ace Frehley's ominous warning to his Kiss bandmates about Music from the Elder, which they did not take heed. Hope y'all dug it, and we'll see you next time.
Stanley the One-Eared Monster. Stanley the One-Eared Monster.
Here.